government puts about 18% tax, 22% GST. Why can't you put in a small percentage of a GST as the ESG fund, or whatever? Because you need the money to build that infrastructure. Yeah. I think it's a brilliant idea, and somewhere, and as
ESG says.
Yeah, ESG says, and put this into the current taxes system. I mean, you have every kind of assess. Why can't you really have it?
Tata's, they started doing this way earlier. There was no stakeholder demanding them to do that. They did it because that was the right thing to do and they saw it. Why does an educational institute need a recruiter to demand this? Why is it not part of the curriculum anyway? Why does it have to be asked by an organization that show me sustainability in your curriculum?
So you would be surprised that every time you take out a barrel of oil from the surface, about 10 barrels of water comes out. 10 to 30 barrels of water comes out. What do you do with that? So that's a problem statement that is getting, people are looking at solving that problem. Midstream, every time you're refining the oil, for every gallon of oil that is getting refined, 3 gallons of water is getting refined.
I think sustainability as a topic should not remain with one subject, rather than it has to be found in all the subjects. For example, if I teach a finance subject, in the finance subject I should be able to discuss about financial implication of being more sustainable and so on. So marketing subject, there should be sustainability and so on. Yeah, so we are living in the world where there is a lot of discussion on climate change, and this climate change is not only affecting in terms of public, it also has a deeper influence on how the corporates operate. So now there are a lot of corporates who have taken this issue as very seriously, and they started reorienting themselves for the climate changes. So this evening we are going to discuss on that. So how the corporate practices are changing given the climate change conditions?
Yeah, I think this is, first of all, it was a boardroom topic at some point of time. Now it is real. People can feel it here and now. Having said that, I think every organization is looking at how do I create a plan around it. But even before creating a plan, the more important thing is, do I understand this, and do I understand this in the context of the wider set of things which are taking place? Now, I can tell you a perspective which I have from my current organization. We in fact conducted a study of close to 2,600 CEOs spread across 120 plus countries, 18 plus industries. And then we started looking at asking them to rank in terms of what are the top priorities that you see. One message which came out very clearly was, look, this is an important topic, but there are interconnected topics. And just not this, the climate resilience and change is just not the topic, but interconnected topics. So the price volatility, the supply chain resilience, the healthcare issues, talent issues. I think these issues are above, in terms of the ranking, they actually outrank the climate issues. And then beyond that, there are trade issues and whatnot. So is it ranking as one of the issues? Answer is yes. Are these issues interconnected? That is also there. I think the question that is there is, okay, there is a climatic issues or set of issues. A, how are they interconnected? And B, what is the impact of that, which needs to be then addressed by the different stakeholders broadly? I think that's where things stand at this point of time.
Yeah, I think I fully agree with that. And I would say that we can look at it in two dimensions, right? One is what organizations are doing. The second is what individuals are also doing. I do feel that for issues like climate resilience, these changes need to be at a much larger scale for the real impact to be there. So while each individual has its own duty, his or her own duty, from an org perspective, at least in the industry that I'm operating in, we see a lot of changes. Definitely a boardroom topic, and as you said, there are multiple priorities that come before you come to sustainability or climate. But even then, it's increasingly taking a lot of importance. Just as an example, you also mentioned supply chain. So I work in e-commerce where the footprint of supply chain is quite high.
Absolutely.
So just making sure that we start moving to electric vehicles to the extent possible. We also move away from a lot of plastic packaging to paper packaging or reusable packaging. These are some of the very, I would say, low-hanging fruits that have been taken up by organizations. And it's not just one organization in e-commerce, but I'd say across the board. For commerce, there's a lot of changes that have been happening in supply chain. I would say that's the start of everything that we do. If we look at the room we are sitting in, the plastic bottles have gone. All hotels now or conference rooms will now have glass bottles for water. So it's these changes that are happening across the board at many levels, while there might be some cost-cutting element to it, which is fine if organizations can be a beneficiary of climate-related changes. But I do believe that there's a lot of movement in the right direction.
I probably have a little disagreement, Lubna, because if you look at the India structure, and I'll just look here, the government has announced that they will go net zero by 2070.
2070. That's
And I'm not sure how many of us will be there to see that happening. And they're probably right, because to really create that infrastructure, this is a RBI report which came out, which I kind of glanced through it, and it said that you need somewhere close to about $15 trillion to make that happen. That's multi-folds of India's economy as of today. So it is extremely important that it doesn't remain just as the boardroom talk, because it's a very fancy word to talk about. Because while you're talking in the boardroom, I'm disagreeing, because you still see the plastic bottles in the boardroom.
Right.
And it's not really changing. So you really need to bring the sustainability in a real practice if you have to bring in a change there. Population is exploding today. And it is exploding at a very fast pace. And I'm talking in particular about India. You have a coastline of 7,000 square kilometers, if I'm not wrong. And the way the climate change is happening, what is going to happen to the cities next to the coastline? It's just for us to really visualize in the years down the line. So something very, very quick needs to happen. Somebody has to take those steps and control that. You need to start building those sustainable cities. You need to start making those sustainable infrastructure. We were actually having a conversation just a while back, and we were saying that you're creating a large city like where we're sitting at this point of time, but is the city really a carbon neutral city? Are we really thinking on those lines? And if we are not, then I think this is still a boardroom talk. The action is still not happening. We need to see some action into this.
So and I think the people who would take the actions are the people who are feeling the heat. As simple as that, right? Now, today, if I just look at, I think it's important to understand where the impact of what you said, right? For example, you say climate change. Where is the climate change impacting? So one of the biggest impacts of the climate change at this point of time is, for example, high sea levels. High sea levels is going to do exactly what you're talking about, which is coastal infrastructure getting affected big time. I was reading a report which said Malaysia typhoon, it's the second largest port, Klang, and you talk about a disruption to the semiconductor industry. People think the disruption to the semiconductor industry took place because of shortage of supply from China and Taiwan, but actually the disruption took place because the ships which are coming to Malaysia, because the coastal infrastructure got disrupted, the packaging could not take place, and packaging could not take place, and hence you could not ship it to the Western economy. So that's a great method by which you saw the disruption happening. Same thing happened in I think the climate change, Rhine River, suddenly the snow melting and the rising levels disrupted the entire supply chain infrastructure. China actually, they had to close the Nissan plant because the commodities which had to reach the plants could not reach because of the flood levels. Now, those are real life situations, and forget about that. You see day in and day out, very recently Chennai floods. It's happening around us. Let's be clear, it's just that we are not acknowledging it that strongly. It is just happening around us because of the climatic change. 3 days of disruptions are closing the industries for a period of time, substantial period of time, and just look at the implications of that. The question then begets is, what does it mean? So yes, I think these things are happening. It cannot be a boardroom talk. It needs to translate into practicalities. It needs to translate into certain actions that need to be taken. What actions are being taken at a broad level, and what kind of organizations and companies are taking those actions? I think it leads to that kind of a method.
I personally feel it has to go beyond the organizations and the corporate. It has to also start from the educational institutions, because still the educational institutions don't really come with courses, which are talking about sustainability, how to live in a sustainable way, how to build sustainable buildings, how to create infrastructure around this. I think you're not going to really get the second course of the corporate getting into that. And that is one of the very core where we really need to start as of today. We're already behind. We need to do this, as of today on this. And I think, and probably Professor Kanagaraj could put some eyes onto it, at what's happening in the educational side. Are you really talking about this? Are you really talking about sustainability and ESG? And are you really talking and focusing on that subject at this point?
So currently in Excel, what we do is we have some specialized subject on sustainability, and every student is mandatorily have to go through the sustainability courses that we have already started. But going forward, I think sustainability as a topic should not remain with one subject, rather than it has to be found in all the subjects. For example, if I teach a finance subject, in the finance subject I should be able to discuss about financial implication of being more sustainable and so on. So marketing subject, there should be sustainability and so on. And it is not just at the teaching level, it also has to be a lot of practical problems have to be discussed as part of the course, so that the student gets an insight on how these type of problems get solved at the corporate level and as at the society level. And moreover, what we do, just to give a good impression for the student as well as make more impactful, our campuses are becoming more sustainable campuses. For example, we have adapted solar power as much as we can, and we started banning plastic usages like what she said, and we try to recycle water, we try to recycle food wastage, and so a lot of things we do at the campus level just to give an impression that, or to give an impact that we are into sustainable. But there is always a challenge. What I understand is any sustainable project requires investment. Now, as a finance guy, I always think that if I invest this much of money, where is my ROI? Let's assume I convert my campus into a green campus. I do everything what is required for sustainable. Is it going to increase my MBA fees? How am I going to get an ROE of this investment? I think most of the companies are stuck with this. So if I invest, where am I finding a return for this? And if you evaluate the sustainable projects or ESG projects from a perspective of those required ROIs and all that capital budgeting tools, I think it gets a very low score. So this is something you can explain us. I think you are consulting for a lot of ESG projects.
I can say that there are broadly, and you hit the nail on the head, because it's a dilemma which people are facing real life, because fundamentally there has to be money which goes into this initiative. What does it mean? Where is the ROI? I look at 3 types of problem statements that are coming in. One is a pressure which is coming from external world, which is an investor pressure, a employee pressure, a regulator pressure, all of them coming in and saying, what are you doing about sustainability? So organizations are taking certain steps around it, and we can talk about what those steps are. So that's one. Second issue which is coming is about the regulations. So regulatory bodies are pushing for certain reports to be published. Now, which is making individuals or the organizations talk about where am I with respect to what is my stated vision, when will I achieve it, what is my path to achieving it, which is, I think, a good thing. It forces you to make a commitment and talk about it. The third thing, which is the point that you said, wherever the money is involved, where are people putting the money? People are putting the money where it also blends with the sustainable, profitable business.
Correct.
So it just cannot be sustainability lens alone. It is a sustainable, profitable business.
Correct.
Superb examples for that. I mean, I have seen examples where people purely for the circular value chain are looking at a method by which I can, like in Europe, e-commerce organization, people are looking at how do I save the cost and actually come out with the packaging and methods by which I can really make it more useful. How can I create certain sustainable products? I think I have seen some of those examples. A good example which I was seeing very recently was for a company, and oil and natural gas is one of those big companies which gets affected by this. And they have been looking at both the upstream and the midstream processing part. So you would be surprised that every time you take out a barrel of oil from the surface, about 10 barrel of water comes out, 10 to 30 barrels of water comes out. What do you do with that? So that's a problem statement that is getting, people are looking at solving that problem. Midstream, every time you are refining the oil, for every gallon of oil that is getting refined, 3 gallons of water is getting consumed. And that's coming from the natural resources. The point is, these organizations now, purely from a compliance perspective, regulatory perspective, are being asked this question. Great, you're making a profit, but natural consumption, natural resources, how are you optimizing it? So looking at mechanisms by which you use effective use of technologies to come out with that.
Yeah. I think the point around return on equity or the cost of how you become sustainable, I do believe that climate is one topic that affects everyone. It affects a rich person, it affects a poor person, it affects an old person, it affects a young person. Unlike a new technology which might affect a certain set of people positively, some negatively, and some not at all, climate is uniform in the way it affects us. So it's important to look at it as different stakeholders and then who is responsible for what. So if you look at individuals as one stakeholder and if you look at organizations as the second stakeholder, I would also put regulators as a third stakeholder. And I believe that the role of regulator becomes very important because for an individual, you can incentivize for them to become more and more attuned and sensitive to climate saving initiatives. And at the same time, for an organization, they can incentivize to some extent, they can penalize to some extent. But it is eventually the regulator which needs to create very, very stringent frameworks in this case to make sure that people start adhering to certain policies. There's a major adaptation that is required in this case, right? We need to change our ways. Organizations need to change their ways. It's only when an individual group starts thinking differently that the organization starts seeing additional shareholder value for the cost that they are incurring. So I do feel that these three stakeholders, an organization, individual and regulator, they are very, very closely related. And the regulator's role on how they are able to navigate, how they are able to use some kind of a carrot and stick approach on both sides of it can have that immediate impact that you're wishing for.
In fact, it's a great point. Sometimes you need that stick to take that action.
Yeah.
And regulators can have that stick,
Yeah.
right? And at least I know in Europe, they are looking at one of the frameworks getting rolled out next year. It's mandatory reporting. I think, as I remember, it's getting pushed out to year after next. But that will mandate the organizations to start reporting their entire ESG reporting practices. They have to report, which essentially means you have to collect the data within the organization about how your consumption patterns are and what you are optimizing. That will force the habit of do you look at that as an investment or do you look at that as a mechanism to optimize certain costs and then actually create a more profitable business? So it will unlock the values of a different type. So that's one thing which is coming up. Second thing, and we keep always talking about the impact of, for example, something like a climate change purely within the remit of environmental aspects. But it actually has a bigger impact on the societal aspects. Right, the society at large gets impacted far more widely from what we see. In fact, one of the interesting parts, we just associate it with the natural calamities and whatnot, the sustainability impact. But the post-COVID impact, think about it. 60% increased adoption of digital channels because of the close age of stores and all the basic accessories. 60% increased adoption of this thing. 15% of the world's population has some form or the other of disability.
Right.
Okay, now you talk about them with visual disability or auditory or motor or any of those. The question is, how do you create a digitally accessible world for them? That's a big thing, by the way. And some regions have taken for example, Canada has a method by which it says your digital sites have to be AA compliant. Europe is coming out with a regulation by 2025. You need to follow a compliance act, accessibility compliance act, and North America already has to some form, but not as strict as the others. One great example I saw was, for example, especially talking about Canada, people who travel, right, like regular commuters, almost. There are 3 million commuters who travel on subway, buses, trams every single day. 3 million. Okay. Think about a population of 10-15% people who have some level of disability. 15% roughly. So that's about 300,000, 450,000 people. All the renewals that need to happen on your card, a single card which works across, that renewal has to be happening through a digital channel.
Right. Yeah.
And how do you make that digital channel compliant to the Accessibility Compliance Act? And which is, a work that we had to undertake, just small work, but very, very meaningful work, just to ensure that they are able to travel far more meaningfully. So, yeah, I think the impact goes beyond the environmental aspect to the societal aspects that we can really think through.
There's another point which crosses my thoughts, and climate is just not and I'm just picking it up from where you left, it's just not a regional problem, it's a global problem.
It is.
And because it's a global problem and the global impacts the environment anyways, what is the role of the developed countries today? And that is they are still, emitting gases, they still, the factories still exist there, and a lot of things. What is happening on that side? Isn't it they who need to start investing and financing and stopping to really control and bring the climatic perspective out there? I think that is another key area which crosses my mind, because as she rightly said, it impacts everyone. So where is that heading to?
You want to take it back?
Yeah, I'm happy.
And especially you, Lubna, because you work for a global company. It's one of the one of the top global companies that you're associated with. What's their role? Are they really investing into a developed country like India when it comes to ESG, and they're saying, we are going to invest and make sure that yes, we're becoming carbon neutral down in a developing nations.
Yeah, I have a mixed answer to that. I do believe that lots of large organizations are being very proactive about it, right? If you look at Apple, you look at Microsoft, Google, Walmart, any large company, they have their own targets. They're also making sure that their subsidiaries in other geographies, and not just their home country or not just the developed countries, but even in developing nations, the subsidiaries are starting to slowly take up carbon neutral goals, or other climate related initiatives are starting to become part of the subsidiaries' nature and form as well. That said, I do think that they also understand that it's not easy. The cost pressures are there, the entire ecosystem around us might not be as developed. So there's some room, some accommodation that is given. At the same time, when we come to an individual level, I do not really agree that it is the developed countries, the onus is on them to do it first. They need to do it for themselves, we need to do it for ourselves, and eventually we are all doing it for that one common earth that we are all on. But as you said, right, it's all connected. So if all of the US or all of Europe starts following extremely amazing sustainability practices, but on the other hand, Asia is burning crops away to glory, we still have that problem, right? It needs to happen in parallel, it needs to happen in tandem. The kind of efforts or initiatives that the developed world can take, in particular on industrial practices might be a lot more evolved, or there's room for them to be more evolved than what we can do here. But in general, I believe that no nation can fall behind in this just because they are developing or somewhere behind in the economic race. I do believe this is one area where everyone needs to be playing on a level field.
Yeah, no, I kind of agree with you totally. But as I said, developing countries like India itself needs trillions of dollars to build that. Where is that financing going to come from? That financing at the end of the day has to come from our developed countries. If you're really serious about this particular matter, and is that really happening? Is a question which I would really put this on to all of you and think that there is a role which developed countries have to play far more than the developing countries. Of course, we have our responsibilities, but developed countries has a much far bigger role in this entire subject than in here.
It's a great question, and I'll give you a personal answer to this one broadly. I think it's a question of almost like a wealth management, right? And in a wealth management portfolio, where do you put the money? At this point of time, everyone wants every single unit to actually give the returns. I think that's where it is. So while in an ideal world, your thought process is right, that's what should happen. Maybe those intentions are getting conveyed, they are being conveyed as intentions. It's not resulting in an execution. And I think we have seen this starting from the first summit of COP to the 28th summit. I think this conversation remains that everyone has been behind their individual goals and the financing that needs to take place. Because I think, as I started the conversation with, we are living in a world which is highly uncertain world. Money is going to places which you had not imagined, and those problems are not going away. So would you want to put this money, quote unquote, to benefit others unless it benefits you? I think that's a broader question which people are grappling with. Having said that, I think this needs to be seen, I agree with your point that individually, and I think this problem will have to be broken down at different parts, and whether it's an organization or an individual or a regulatory body or a country, they will have to take their respective set of actions to cumulatively see what it will result in. So as an example, my organization actually has taken a very, very bold, they defined a very bold vision on multiple fronts, right? For example, on the environmental front, we committed that by 2025, as against a baseline of 2016, we will cut down our emissions by about 11%. So we said that we'll eliminate single-use plastic, we will get into 100% renewable energy sources with respect to all offices. We have taken those measures, and that's happening. By 2023, we will have all offices which will be running on renewable energy sources, as an example. Bigger than the environmental impact, we have taken bigger goals on the people-related agenda. And on people-related agenda, one thing which we have said by 2025 will be a gender-neutral workforce, which I think is probably the biggest audacious goal which an IT organization has taken, which always has been skewed on one side, right? So gender neutral workforce by 2025, 30% of the execs being women. I think these are audacious goals that have been taken. Supplier diversity, we have taken goals not only in terms of who they are, their scope 2, scope 3 emissions, their inclusion, diversity practices, whatnot. So I think we have taken those goals. And then governance and reporting in terms of what do we report, what are our ethics and compliance standards and whatnot. So are we individually, is every organization trying to be a responsible organization? I think that's a broad question. Some are not. And the ones which are not will get forced by the regulatory bodies to be quote unquote responsible, because you have to adopt certain practices. And that movement has to start somewhere. Now, the second part of it, which is going to your point in terms of can we do something above and beyond what we are doing, which needs to be done within our boundaries? For example, from a impact to the society perspective, we may be running certain programs, Skills to Succeed program. We have given a commitment that we'll develop 5 million IT professionals outside, right? We'll create that workforce and we'll create that infrastructure. At this point of time, I know every single organization is trying to do that, again because of the regulatory, not regulatory, the shareholder pressure. the external pressure and shareholder pressure, the CEOs are being forced to say what is your stand on the local issues and geopolitical issues. So I believe at an organization level, people are being in some ways quote unquote mandated or forced to live in that realm, and people are doing it meaningfully. The questions are slightly more outside. Are the same practices being followed at the governance level, the government levels and other levels, and what is a role based on geopolitical issues, based on all other sundry things that they have to deal with holistically.
That's true. You know, I think a great example from where Professor Kanagaraj comes, a city which has been handmade by one of the India's largest conglomerate. I would love to know a bit about that city, to be very honest. What's happening in that city, which is an ideal city in this country, which people want to copy in? Is there really a focus on the ESG? Is that city really a sustainable city? Because I've heard stories that electricity doesn't go there. How is electricity really produced there? Is the solar really being used there? Where are your takes on that part?
Yeah, Tata being more responsible organization, they do a lot for sustainability. There is no doubt about it. And for the last 1 decade, I have been observing the firm very closely. So a lot of things what they have implemented for sustainable development, and they continue to do so. In terms of electricity, what you spoke about, they have electricity, and they are also moving more into renewable. And water, yes, that is the only city maybe probably in the whole country which gives a 24 hours water supply and a clean potable water. And they have been doing a lot, and that is one of the city which has more green cover than any other city. So they have been doing this even before we started discussing about climate changes and all that. They have been doing it for quite long. But though they do, right, in the interest of society, in the interest of people who live around that firm and who are dependent on that firm, they do this. But do other firms practice this? For example, he spoke about shareholders' demand. Is there really a stakeholder demand from the organization to be sustainable? For example, let me take, I come from educational industry. So let's take, do my student demand a campus which is sustainable campus? Do my student demand a curriculum which has a lot of sustainability in it? Do my recruiters who recruit from my campus demand for sustainable practices or the curriculum which has sustainability? Do my owners or the trustees of the trust, do they demand for this? Unless and until there is a demand, stakeholder demand for sustainable practices.
That's a great point, actually.
Sustainable,
very good point,
sustainable practices. There is no what you call it as pressure on me to practice this. For example, you spoke about regulatory, what you call it as influence. But do regulatory influence really create a sustainable practice? Because to me it looks like for the purpose of meeting the mandatory requirements, you will do something and get away with it. But unless and until there is a serious stakeholder demand, I think the firms may not give a very serious thought. For example, let's assume if there are a large number of investors who are willing to invest only looking at the sustainable practices of the firm or the accreditation, what they have around that, then probably you will start giving more focus towards that. Do we have that? There are some practices I have been looking at. For example, I was reading something and there I found that MSCI has created an index, right, which is a what you call it as decarbonized index, and that index is being practiced by many fund houses these days to build their portfolios. So these type of practices, if it becomes popular and it has a greater demand from the stakeholders, I think the sustainability practices will come in much more force than forcefully mandated on them through regulatory.
It's a great takeaway, actually, and probably Lubna, you could probably put a shed light on this. Does it happen at your organization where do they really look at organization with sustainable practices to do business with or partner with and so on?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say it's both sides. Our stakeholders or investors in our organization, they demand that of us. And at the same time, we are looking, you talked about looking at vendors, suppliers, their practices, their scores, their inclusion policies. So at the same time, we are doing the same for partners that we are working with. Again, right, eventually it also becomes a question of how do you measure, which is where some kind of a framework or some kind of a policy or guidance on what people need to adhere to becomes important. But I think absolutely stakeholder demand is the heart of it. And I do believe that stakeholder demand again requires a mindset change, because if you keep breaking down stakeholders, eventually the smallest unit is an individual.
Yes.
Right? Multiple individuals are forming multiple units of stakeholders. In the Indian context, I don't know about outside, but at least in the Indian context, it needs to become a part of education. It needs to start getting ingrained in our education system. And the only time a student in college is going to come and ask you about sustainability policies or courses is if they have grown up hearing about it.
Correct.
Otherwise, it's going to be some people who would most likely be called woke by their peers, who would be making noise about this and getting a little bit of way, but not much. So it needs to become part, it has to be a grassroots change. It has to be part of every household's discussion. Only then the entire mindset changes and we start seeing changes across the board.
See, for example, Deepak was asking whether Excel practices sustainable courses and do we have in the curriculum. See, let's put it like this. If more and more corporates who recruit from us, and if they demand for a curriculum which needs this, and do you think educational institution can get away with that? We need to have a curriculum which is tuned towards sustainability, right? So therefore, the stakeholder demand is something which can change the sustainable practice. This is what I thought.
I think the current mindset broadly is a reactive mindset, which means if there is a failure somewhere, then you think about, I need to do something about it. I mean, COVID was a classic case.
As long as that shock remains.
Yeah, the shock. So COVID shock gave a supply chain shock. People moved out of China, looking at resilient other countries, so invest in India and whatnot. So I think maybe that kind of a shock is one thing. And by the way, we are not away from many such shocks to come in future, unfortunately. I think that's where we are. And I think you talking about the coastal infrastructure you're talking about, currently we are just living through the floods and whatnot, but what I'm hearing and reading is that some of the cities will just get underwater. With the rising sea levels, some of the coastal cities will just get underwater.
There will be many countries you won't see in years to come. That's reality.
And unfortunately, unless some of those actions happen, there is an issue. Agriculture, big thing. By the way, I was seeing this other thing about by 2050, our food demand will go up by 70%. 70%. And 25% of our food production gets wasted. 25% of the water which gets into that production gets wasted, essentially. That's the world that we are in right now. So you have a 70%.
And on the other side, if you have a drought, the food prices go up. It's all happening in there.
So there are those concerns and issues. Few organizations are very proactive about doing it. Few of them which are, I would call, for a lack of better term, social enterprises who care better about the society and things at large. They are doing their respective jobs. But then others are taking this also as a good, sustainable, profitable business model, which I think is in my opinion, for a majority cases, if we apply that mindset, not a bad idea. Because you are combining sustainability, you are combining it as a business idea. You are creating a new product, you are creating new service, you are creating new consumer base, you are creating conscious consumerism in the process, you are changing the habits of people and whatnot. I think so. My view is that's a great way for the different people to go. And I believe private enterprises actually have a much stronger role to play than the government and government bodies, because they change. The governments change after X number of years in every single country for whatever reasons, and they have to deal with many other things unless it is their survival. Whereas private enterprises remain for a period of time, right? Private or listed enterprises remain for a period of time, and to that extent, they have to do things for their own, not only survival but growth and relevance, right, at any point of time.
No, absolutely. And just to add to that, I think we've been talking about a regulatory perspective. Somewhere, a premier educational institutions of all kinds in India should work down with the government very closely to create those regulatory front, because that has to, educational institutions and the government can really make that happen, because private sector will still have their own objectives to be met, and that is where I think there's a dual role you have to play here in this entire scheme.
I 100% agree with you. I mean, sustainability as a topic is actually a DNA topic. It is no longer a topic which you can watch from the side or make it as a boardroom topic. A simple thing like if you are even taking water from the tap, right? Do you actually have an aerator in the tap? We don't apply that mindset most of the time, and then you realize that you have wasted 10 times the water that you really wanted to have.
Right.
So just that mindful ways of changing habits, and we need triggers for that, and some of those triggers can come in the educational institute right in the very beginning, that hey look, I think go to your home every single day, whether it is electric, whether it is, don't wait for the products and services to evolve, but there are few things you can change yourself. What are those habits?
Absolutely, and what I was just talking when we started this conversation, that Bangalore is a very magical city, because the lakes here suddenly there's a froth and a foam on the lake. I mean, that's there was a case when there was a river, or there was a water body which caught fire. Now just imagine, now this is something when we're talking about climate, and this is all the impact of, because of that, what's happening in, where is the regulatory framework, who's controlling this, who's really putting that into the structure? I think there is something seriously wrong, and you're absolutely right. We have to look into this. We really can't say, all right, you first and you first. No, why can't we first and really controlling and make it happen? Let's take an example of Tata Nagar and say, all right, yeah, we can make that happen and replicate this in the other parts too.
In fact, the Tata example is interesting, right? And I'll go back to related to the educational institutional point. The Tatas, they started doing this way earlier. There was no stakeholder demanding them to do that. They did it because that was the right thing to do, and they saw it. Why does an educational institute need a recruiter to demand this? Why is it not part of the curriculum anyway? Why does it have to be asked by an organization that show me sustainability in your curriculum?
No. See what happens if you have to enforce practices, right? Sometimes the enforcement need not be through only regulatory angle. If there is a demand from stakeholders, then obviously what happens, to meet the requirements of the stakeholders or demands of the stakeholders, you get a chance to change. For example, as he said, why don't you bring in sustainability in the curriculum? We will certainly do that, but at what pace, right? I will take my own sweet time to do that, right? My transition will be very gradual. But let's assume if there is a demand for it, then automatically what will happen? I need to act quickly and bring in a transition. And we also have to understand we live in the world of time constraint and resource constraint.
Yeah.
So if I have to fit in sustainability focus, then I have to get something out of it. What am I taking out of it, right? I have to push this content. Now when I have to push this content, I have to take some content out, and is that the content which is demanded by the recruiter or not, right? So it is something
It's a bit of a paradoxical behavior. I mean, at the end of the day, there is a paradoxical thing which is built in terms of what, I mean, this is my interest versus our interest at a broad level, right? And broadly, as a society, my interest precedes our interest, barring a few select ones. I think that's a mindset. And that's where, in some ways, the regulatory methods help, right? At least, or a stakeholder method helps to, for example, we have been talking about coming out of natural fuel for a long time here, right? And we are saying, can we have cars which are more electrified and whatnot? Now, I don't think currently, I mean, obviously it means a time frame by which it needs to happen. Unfortunately, we are also in the evolutionary phase. You can't put a time frame because of multiple reasons and constraints. So, few such things will remain. We'll have to live through those uncertainties. But what is certain from our side to your point, at an individual level, which is a very, very conscious choice which we can make, whether it's an individual or an organization or a group at large, which is in some ways measurable and reportable, or makes us feel accountable. I believe that's important. Now,
Right.
how do you induce it at every single level? That is critical.
No, absolutely right. I mean, since our childhood, you keep learning that switch off the light, but nobody tells you why to switch off the light.
Right.
Why is it important to save that power?
Yeah.
Now, and that is an angle. You know, my son comes back from the school and he says that he's doing a project where he needs to write it, why he needs to save electricity. So
The
I
purpose.
counter question him. I said, what do you think? Why do you need to save electricity? And you know, his immediate, because
You're a good coach.
you know, I've been taught and I've been asked all the time to switch it off. That's one. If we don't switch it off, then all the electricity will go off. We will not get. But they don't really understand or taught that why, because there's so many natural resources have been used to produce this electricity. It has to be saved. Natural resources are limited. They will finish it someday.
I think that the point that you're making is so right. It is. It starts with why.
Yeah.
And the why and the purpose, if it is getting defined and if it gets into the DNA in certain form and way, it will have at least
Yeah.
a much better impact than what we have currently. Not to say other actions are not important, but that's a fundamental shift that is
Absolutely.
required.
According to me, the biggest blocker in all climate related initiatives is commercial incentives. To the point that you raised, switch off the light. If someone asks why, the answer is ki bill aayega. That's why switch off the light. It's not that we don't need it, why are we wasting electricity, right? Now that answer comes up, you will hear people say that very often. To me, the second part, right, beyond the commercial intent, is the second part is education. The DNA can change over time only if people grow up learning that they need to conserve electricity, they need to conserve natural resources. So at some point, schools across the world, especially in India, need to start putting this as part of their syllabus.
The definition of defining regenerative methods is possibly the most understated things today. Currently, we are just talking about prevention, even at a broad level. How can I control the temperature? How can I control the wastage? How can I create a circular economy with whatever objectives and whatnot? Day you put a goalpost which is bigger than that, and say, hey, look, I think I need to give to Earth more than what I have taken away, is the day you will at least get to a neutral state, hopefully. And what is that regenerative state? What is that more state? And how do you put it back in the conversations? I think that's very, very important in defining. Sometimes you have to put a stretch goal for you to even reach the real goals, right?
You know, I just remembered a conversation I was having a couple of weeks back with the dean of XLRI, Chhajar, and the father was just talking about it, and he said we should all learn on how to use limited resources, live within limited resources, minimal living, and that is where it connects to the point that we have not touched in that ESG angle. We spoke about environment, we spoke about governance, but that social angle of creating an equitable society, of creating is so very important to also make an impact on an environment in some way or the other.
Right.
You know, and I think I can actually relate with what Father was talking the other day in terms of minimalistic living, because that is really going to change on how the rich really looking at spending and living and controlling environment. So I think that's another area to really.
It's a great point, and it just reminds me of, for example, the films we used to have. In the camera,
Right.
36 photos you could take. On a single day, you had to take 36 photos, nothing more, nothing less. So you would control your entire day's cycle and mentally imagine where I'll take what pictures to get to that 36. And today you just, I mean, our own photo shoots where I could hear the number of clicks,
Yeah.
and I'm sure beyond the clicks, the amount of things that get uploaded to the cloud and whatnot. I mean,
Yeah.
it is there, right? It is. So we have changed the world. We have changed the definition of where we were to where we are going. Uh, the most important and essential parts, at least at a ground level, food consumption. I think at least in the organized places, forget about unorganized places, organized places, the Japanese ways of doing things, which is small portions kept, you take that, you want to take more, you take more, right? But it is always in small portion, which means your quantity of what will get wasted is a small quantity, it is not a more quantity. Maybe it's a good practice from a corporate perspective, right? Even when you are serving, why do you want to put everything in a big bowl and have a big plate, and why not the small pieces in a way which can be leveraged in a meaningful way? Water, I talked about, can you put some kind of an aerator in that one? Again, I think it's not that we have not done it. We have come through generations where we were actually practicing it.
Yeah.
It's just that we have gone worse. And we are going even beyond that. And now we are saying we have to go back, one step back. It will require, I don't know, I believe whatever changes we can bring in at a grassroots level of educating people and saying this needs to be done, needs to be done. Otherwise, nature will have its own ways of correcting
Lubna
it.
would say that, let's not talk about this because that's my business here. That's going to get impacted.
My thought on innovation broadly is, at this point of time, the way I see innovation is getting associated with a profitable business. So people are launching new products or new services as long as it is also making them profitable, which is a great intersection in some ways. So we recently worked for a oil extractor. The offshore logistic cost for them runs into $300 billion, big time. And the cost of having idle vessels at offshore is 40% of the total cost they incur, just the idle vessels. And what we actually worked with this organization was to create a B2B marketplace where the idle capacity could be leveraged for something else. Some other businesses could leverage that idle capacity of the shipping this thing, route optimization, fuel optimization, all of that. And it's unlocking about a $9 billion the economy and the
But
organization.
meanwhile, you
itself.
also address sustainability.
You address sustainability because 700K worth emission is CO2 emission was taking place, which is getting cut in the process.
So in that development, I mean, the solution what you gave, was ESG the prime goal or profit maximization was the goal?
Good point. You ask different stakeholders, you'll get different answers. But it resulted in both. Let's put it this way. And I'm perfectly fine with
what I'm saying, in this problem solving, it so happened that you achieved both the goals.
You achieved both the
And,
goals.
what if there is another problem solving? Do you keep ESG as the prime goal to address it?
There are companies which have done it for survival. So, for example, I know of a company which actually was almost started from the coal. 120-year-old company started with coal, has moved into chemicals, and now is moving into nutrition. So the evolution of the company is such that it is required from a survival perspective, because I don't want to be seen by my shareholders and the community in that aspect. So the company itself has evolved. But I think those are drastic innovations, right? There is a company's survival. I believe the real innovations will come, for example, supply chain. What she's talking about in her, the CPG industry, the marketplaces, the retail industry, huge innovation possible. Agriculture industry, people are looking at the, for example, the way you create the seeds, the way you create the food, the way you process the food, the way you reduce the wastage, transportation of the food and perishable, and what kind of innovation can be brought in to cut that cost down. I believe those are real innovation, because it is regulating your entire supply chain, it is bringing down the cost of operations, at the same making your business more profitable, at the same time resulting in reduced the wastage. So
One area I would add to that list is also sustainable materials, especially from a construction perspective, because eventually most of the times indoors in some form of construction, be it at work or home.
Yes.
So if there are sustainable materials that can be innovated on, and I know a lot of companies are doing that already, but doing that in a way that the end result or the materials that are being generated, they are economical, they are affordable for the common population, and second is they need to be resilient. You can't be changing them every 2 years or 3 years because they wear off that fast. That is another area where innovation can really help.
That's a great example. You need to create buildings which can last forever. You and I were actually discussing earlier about AI, and I think that is the future looks good in terms of the entire technology, coming up into the surface on how the innovation can really manage this. But I'm going to go to the earlier points. My friend Sikandar Kuller, he gave some couple of very, very brilliant ideas. He said, why doesn't, and this is on a regulatory perspective, government puts about 18% tax, 22% GST. Why can't you put in a small percentage of a GST as the ESG fund, or whatever? Because you need the money to build that infrastructure. Yeah. I think it's a brilliant idea, and somewhere.
And ESG says.
Yeah, ESG says, and put this into the current taxes system. I mean, you have every kind of a cess. Why can't you really have an ESG cess? And I think it's a...
No, but if I have a sustainable practice, I should not pay cess, no?
I think that could be debated onto a multiple other taxes as well. But I think, which I was coming on creating...
I think it's a question of
priorities, yeah. So
it's a question of prioritization of what... is it, I mean, it goes back to the point of currently we pay education cess as an example. Yeah. So is education a priority over sustainability, and hence should that cess be? So I'm saying those are the debates which government...
You will create priorities, and as Sikandar also pointed out on if the priority is, AIDS was one of the key priorities for the government to really eradicate this, and they did that. If ESG becomes that kind of a priority level, they will work on this. So that becomes a very, very key notion to really think and talk, and I think it's a key where, as I said, the premier educational institutions of this country should work along with the government in creating that structure and announcing it, because you cannot leave that to the private sector at any point.
But I think the current dispensation has this mindset, the way how they participate in international forums for climate change, and the goal what they set and agree upon internationally.
Goals are still not set. The US is still not set when they're going to go net carbon. The goals they keep deferring that. The goals are still not set there. So I think at the international conferences also it remains a boardroom talk as it remains here in the country. So
I think it needs to be controlled where it can be controlled. There are areas where we wish it can be controlled. You have equal chance of it happening and not happening. So I think it's a...
So I had one interesting conversation with one of the senior leader and I was asking him, why do you sell beverages in PET bottle? Why don't you replace it with something else? And he said that, look, it is not that we are not practicing any sustainability. Almost all our bottles, PET bottles, what we create is all from a recycled plastic. So what you actually consume is from a recycled bottle. So therefore, we have a ESG practice. That's what he said.
I think
but as a consumer, when I buy the PET bottle, I mean, for me, it looks like this particular firm is not very conscious of ESG. Therefore, still it is trying to sell everything in the plastic bottle. So how do we look at this? I mean, is this a good practice?
Look, I think at least the way I see about, and this goes back to the value chain, from the product creation all the way till it going back to the earth and whatnot. And one of the biggest challenges, and you're talking about part of the cycle where someone has said, okay, I did the right product design, I actually am selling the right product, I have marketed it, and maybe I'm making more profit by calling it sustainable, and there is quote unquote sustainable consumerism which is actually also paying for it. So all that you have solved. The challenge that has not been solved is, still that bottle is going into your white bag at your home, which is getting mixed up with thousands of other things, not getting segregated. And there is no way to segregate that to actually recycle and and put it back in the life cycle the way it needs to be.
Yeah.
So and that's where the challenge is.
Education. It still rounds up to the education. I think and it has to start at a very, very basic level, and it comes to equality. It comes to a social structure and social framework and how to change this. Because at home, I was just thinking about this, and when you said the helps at the home come greatly dressed. You can hardly differentiate whether they live there or they are basically the helps. So the outer outlook has come on a very equitable front. Brilliant, right? But inside, it hasn't really changed. And how do you change that? And somebody over a conversation just generally said that unless and until there is a need, you will not change. Do they really have a need to change? Possibly not. It doesn't matter to them when they are putting the garbage out of the home that they really have to segregate it. Is there really a need of doing this? So you need to create that need, and you need to create that education to make that happen. So that social framework plays an extremely important role in this entire climate sustainability structure that we try to create.
And by the way, that will your perspective on need will hit us the most for a simple reason. For example, we know the city we live in, there have been landfills around, and at some point of time the landfills have got filled. So you don't have any more landfills left where you can. So the local corporation, what does it do? It says you have to segregate at the source. You have to decompose what you can decompose within your complex or the area where you live in, and then only take out the dry waste, give it to me separately, or you figure out it. And tomorrow, if they cannot solve that problem, it will be given to a private party and say you have to work with a private party to solve that problem. So the need will drive certain specific actions. But the question is, do we wait till it is a reaction? End of the day, it's a reaction because you don't have a proactive solution to it. The question is, do you want to convert it into almost like a South Korean economy where you are saying almost 90-95% of the, the entire cycle which I was talking about is very well thought through, right from the source till the disposal is very well thought through. So can we actually bring that in? But that requires a discipline, and that requires a regulation. So
that requires education.
And that requires education. So all those things come into picture at a.
By the way, I do think that in addition to all of this, it's somewhat related to your need point or the prioritization point, that how important do governments think this is. Look at COVID. Overnight, everything was shut down. People were fined like anything for months after for not wearing masks. And we were able to change the DNA of literally every person, be it a villager, be it a city dweller, be it anyone. You cannot step out, you're going to stay in the house. If you go, you will be 5 people in the shopping, in the supermarket at a time, and you're maintaining distance, everything. And while a lot of those things have now gone back, you still see so many people wearing masks. You still see the use of hand sanitizer so actively, which was not a part of our lives earlier. So if our regulators do decide at some point that this is really important, there are very stringent measures that can be taken in the short term to change, to enforce that behavioral change, which will then, and plus if you add the grassroots education level change, then over the years there's a top-down forced pressure and there is mindset change that happens, which could help us save the planet. But it really depends on what people are prioritizing. If it's short-term votes, if it is just who's going to win the next election, then it's very tough.
Great. No, I think this is a fantastic topic. We all feel for it. And the thing that we really need to think is what actions can we take, what actions can we influence. as the people in this room.
No, I think I'll leave that with Lubna's perspective. We all have a role to play.
Yes.
So one last question for you. Since you work in technology, could you tell us how technology helps in solving this ESG problem?
Multiple ways. I think, for example, by the way, interesting thing about technology itself is role of technology in increasing the greenhouse gas emission, which itself is something which is to be debated. So it's said by 2040, ICT industry, information communication technology industry, the emissions will increase from 4 to 14%. 14% emissions will be contribution because of that. Few things that come to my mind. One is the areas, the technology itself which is driving the emission. What steps are being taken around that? People are definitely looking at data centers and moving them to renewable energy sources than from the fossil fuels, and which is one of the biggest contributors, essentially. Second thing which we have seen is if you look at, there's an increased focus on software development life cycle, and going back to the example of film roll, do you need 36? You need 36. Why would you do 360? So essentially, I think there's a method which is coming in terms of the coding practices, what is most optimal, which will have a carbon impact. So I think that correlation is being made to ensure that you do it optimally. Third thing which is coming is about the data. Now, 70 good number of organizations are now thinking about how can I control the data within my organization. So 70% of the data is not really required, which we think is required for personalization, hyper-personalization. 70% data is not required. So question is, how do I purge that data to protect the emissions which would otherwise be required based on this thing. And fourth is the AI. While it's a boon, it is also a ban. And the question is, what algorithms do you run, how optimally do you run to ensure that you don't end up that. So purely technology resulting in emissions, there are controls being put by the organizations in place. So that's one part of it. Second part of it is technology playing a role in the larger set of initiatives. So for example, we talk about the value chain, the circularity. Within circularity, the entire supply chain management, huge problem statement which technology is actually trying to solve. In multiple different ways, there are solutions that are getting created around that one. Optimizations that are getting created around that. There are solutions which are getting created around the green UX to say that do I really need all the colors and everything? Because it has an emission impact, so do I just want to cut it down? Not directly related to technology, but communication, brand communication. So companies, organizations saying I am a sustainable brand, I am following sustainable practices, I have the sustainable ecosystem for a sustainable consumerism. I think that's another area which is picking up. And then all the areas that you talked about, which is sustainable manufacturing, sustainable in the automobile industry. For example, we are working on a program where for a car which is there, you're looking at you're looking at methods within the car which will give you proactive signals at what point of time the parts need to be replaced. And the idea is that the product and the service is getting integrated in a way that you will replace the part. You will be forced to replace the part so that you elongate the life cycle and whatnot. So that's a part which is coming in. Every industry, whether financial services, of course, it's given that sustainable lending and all those practices, technology will come in. So technology is being used on one side, which is technology solving technology problems which have been created by technology. Technology solving the problems related to the larger, whether it's net zero problem or a circularity problem or a brand communication problem. And even, for example, the compliance and reporting problem, which is actually how do I go back and report in a certain way? It's solving those problems.
Good. Wonderful conversation. Really enjoyed it. I think this can carry on because it's a subject which impacts everybody, and I think it's wonderful. Thanks for your thought, guys.
Thank you. Thank you so much.